Our next special guest is Professor David Flint. So many letters, David. Order of Australia, chaired the ABA, co-authored the book Give Us Back Our Country, and there's many more. So I've had a fair bit to do with David over the last 4 years, and believe me, he's a gentleman, and he's well and truly on our side, and he wants our country back. So I'll hand you over to Professor Flint.
Ladies and gentlemen, at least that's what I was going to say, but under the Safe Schools program, that's forbidden. You're not supposed to say ladies and gentlemen, you're not supposed to say boys and girls, you've got to use non-gender discriminatory language. Now, Peter Manuel came to a conference we held in Sydney for Australians for Constitutional Monarchy. It was our 17th national conference since the referendum. And Peter had some very important comments to make because we discussed some other constitutional issues. And one of the delegates came up to me and said, she didn't know Peter's name, but she said, our hero farmer from Western Australia. And I said, you're wrong there. He's from South Australia, not Western Australia. Well, what I wanted to talk to you tonight about is Give Us Back Our Country, which is a book that Jai Martinkovitz and I wrote a couple of years ago. But I think it still has relevance today, and I'm not trying to flog the book. But I think there is certainly a problem. I wanted to briefly remind you what the country was and finally come to what I think are the general solutions that we can try. A few weeks ago, Andrew Bolt, writing in the Herald Sun in Melbourne, said that Malcolm Turnbull is the worst Liberal Prime Minister since Sir William McMahon. Those of you who are old enough to remember, there are not many here who are old enough to remember, but I can remember that Sir William McMahon was Prime Minister. He was defeated by Gough Whitlam. I wrote a piece then for the Daily Telegraph in Sydney, which was entitled, which referred to this, and then said, this is unfair. It's unfair to Sir William McMahon. Because Sir William McMahon had, for example, never made a racist outburst, as Malcolm Turnbull did in relation to the backpackers, whom he condemned as rich white kids from Europe. That was when he wanted to tax them at 30% of what they earned. In fact, of course, William McMahon never needed backpackers on the farms because Australians went and did the work in those days. So William McMahon didn't have a federal debt rocketing to 20% of gross domestic product with an interest bill which would build a new Adelaide hospital every month. And when interest rates increased and the debt increases in a very short period of time, that'll be about 2 Adelaide hospitals a month, which we could use just in return for the interest rates we have to pay. So William McMahon didn't have a country in which we had the highest electricity prices probably in the world, particularly in this state. He lived in he managed a country in which electricity prices were among the lowest in the world. He didn't preside over the deindustrialisation of Australia. Our schools and universities were the best in the world. They weren't declining, just as gender fluidity was being taught in the schools. He didn't apply a special tax on self-funded retirees or reduce pensions. He was very careful in his approach to immigration. Both Sir William and Turnbull ran very poor election campaigns, but Bill McMahon didn't have the good luck that Turnbull had. Turnbull had a Premier of Victoria who decided to try and unionise the firefighters in the bush and consequently lost Victoria and therefore won the election by 1 seat. McMahon lost his election to Whitlam by 8 seats. Turnbull lost 14 seats and just scraped in. What I wanted to talk to you briefly at the beginning of this was about giving us back our country and what has happened and what the problem is. In 2006, there was a schools report in Australia, and it said that three quarters of the children in the schools in Australia couldn't explain why, in a multi-choice question, why we celebrate Australia Day. 3/4 of the children in Australia. The New South Wales Minister of Education rushed into the media and said, well, whatever's happening in the rest of Australia, history teaching in New South Wales is the very best in the country. And one of the radio interviewers impertinently asked her, oh, by the way, Minister, why do we celebrate Australia Day? And she said, oh, that's the day all the states decided to unite into one single federation. In other words, she obviously didn't know that that was the foundation when Philip came to Sydney and landed and established the first colony. So if a minister doesn't know this, how can we expect students to know this, particularly if they're not being taught this? And this is at a time when record sums of federal taxes are being poured into the schools, and they can't teach history, they can't teach lots of other things. Standards are falling by comparison with countries all around the world, and yet we're teaching gender fluidity in the schools. This indicates a problem, not only in education, a problem in the governance of this country, and a very serious problem in the governance of the country. I've come to the conclusion that there are few problems today in this country which haven't been created by or exacerbated by the politicians. Very few problems we have at home. And I know from my own experience in tertiary education and at the Broadcasting Authority that governments are incapable of undertaking the simplest tasks without wasting enormous amounts of money, which confirms in my mind it's better to leave as much as you can to the people of Australia to do themselves rather than governments doing them. What I find extraordinarily absent in the politicians of this country is the sort of common sense that you find across this country. Alan Jones, I think, devised what is probably the best test of public policy in this country. He asked on 2GB, does it pass the pub test? In other words, this is the sort of things which rank and file Australians would say in a pub, well, that's probably a good thing to do. And most politicians adopt all sorts of policies that don't pass the pub test. And with the exception of Senator Malcolm Roberts and a few others, I've noticed, for example, that when it comes to discussing the climate, there is firstly a universal belief in the theory of global warming, and it still is only a theory that the planet is warming, notwithstanding the hysteria on the evening news. I know that when I go back to my youth, Sydney was a hotter city, had longer heat waves than it has today, and certainly I'm not confirmed, I'm not sure that there has been significant global warming. I'm certainly not confirmed that the principal cause of this is man-made carbon dioxide emissions. I doubt if it's true, can be reversed by the United Nations, by the countries agreeing in the United Nations. And I know, and you know, that even if we agree to cut our global carbon emissions, other countries won't be doing it. We know that. We know, for example, that if we stop burning coal in this country and we're exporting coal to China, that the coal will be burnt in China. And common sense would tell you, if coal burning has this effect on the climate, it's going to have the same effect whether it's burnt here or in China. And yet our politicians tell us we must stop burning coal in this country. Well, I come to the second thing, and that is, what was the country that we should take back? What was Australia like? And if you put aside technology, there were technological advances which have improved our lives and certainly improved medicine, at least in the hospitals, in operations and so on. But apart from that, when you come to the things which governments do, the country has not improved. It's becoming more and more evident from studies internationally that the reason why a country is successful is not so much because of its race, it's not so much because of its geography, it's not even so much because of its resources, because think of Switzerland, which is significantly richer than Australia and has absolutely no resources apart from making clocks and a few chocolate and a few other things like that. What many researchers are coming to the conclusion is that it's the institutions, the fundamental institutions of a country that make it successful. And just look at the two Koreas, North Korea and South Korea. South Korea with modern Western-style institutions, North Korea with antiquated communist institutions. One is very rich, other is a terrible dictatorship in which people live lives which are absolutely awful and sometimes starve to death. But a better example from our point of view is between Australia and Argentina. About the time of Federation, we were probably on a per capita basis the two richest countries in the world. Argentina was very much tied to the British Empire in her exports and in her investments, as was Australia. But since that time, there has been a significant decline in Argentina. Her institutions have collapsed. She's changed her governance. Her constitutional system has collapsed. She's been turned into a dictatorship, gone back into democracy, dictatorship, democracy. Argentina is now heading, or probably already is, in the third world, from being one of the richest countries in the world, and never having had to make, never deciding to make the same contribution in the two world wars that Australia did. And we are such a rich country. On an ABC program a few years ago, an Argentinian minister was asked, why is Australia so successful? And why isn't Argentina as successful as Australia is? And he said the difference is Australia has British institutions. Australia has inherited British institutions. If we had the same institutions, we would be like Australia. If you go back to the time of Governor Phillip, when he came to Australia, he brought to Australia a number of institutions which are still with us today. Our language, of course. But although it was a penal colony, he also brought the rule of law. Now, Malcolm Turnbull, when he was just a backbencher, made a speech in which he said that Australia at the time that it was settled in 1788 and for many years thereafter was no more than a British gulag. A British gulag. It wasn't, you know, because Phillip brought a Charter of Justice. He brought the rule of law. There's a wonderful story of two convicts who fell in love man and woman, they fell in love, they were in jail together. They were married soon after they came to Sydney. They had a little boy. But on the journey to Sydney, some of their property, which had been awarded to them because there'd been a charity raising for them in London because people were sympathetic for the girl who had the little baby. And they brought a considerable amount of property to Sydney, which in current money was worth probably $40,000 or $50,000. It was bought in one of the ships by one of the captains. But when they asked for the property, when they got to Sydney, the captain said, "Oh, it had all been washed overboard, there was very little left." They decided, the husband, whose name was Cable, he decided that he would do something about it. And he went to see one of the officials, one of the officials that Philip had with him, who was in charge of legal matters, and that official issued a summons to the captain of the ship. The captain was brought before a court of civil jurisdiction, sitting in Sydney in the open air, soon after the first fleet arrived. They heard the case, they heard evidence from all the sailors, and the judge advocate, who was not a trained lawyer, he was a naval officer, which is probably all to the good, he handed down a decision in favour of the convicts, of a very substantial amount of money in those days. Now that sort of a thing doesn't happen in gulags. I don't think Mr. Turnbull would be able to tell us of any case in any Soviet gulag or Nazi prisoner of war camp where prisoners could actually sue for damages and be awarded damages. The rule of law came to Australia with Philip, and Philip also took a magnificent decision. He said, he wrote in his diary, "The moment His Majesty's forces take possessions, there will be no slavery in this free land." He decided that for the very first time in the world, there would be a continent without slavery. This was something which was celebrated and talked about and taught to school children for many years ago. Of course, it's not mentioned these days. It's not considered something important, but it was an extraordinary decision. Philip also brought constitutional government under the Crown, although it was a penal colony, and he brought civil society, that which supports sensible government, civil society based on Judeo-Christian values. Within a very short period of time, before the Eureka Stockade, the British had agreed to give most of the colonies self-government. And that was granted in the middle of the 19th century. And then followed federation, which we ourselves built, which was an extraordinary thing which children should be taught about, but they're not taught about. The two great commentators on federation make the important point that never before had a group of virtually self-governing communities, without external pressure or war of any kind, deliberately chosen from a simple and intellectual conviction of the advantages of nationhood and the disadvantages of disunity to form one country. And this they did by a free vote. Probably the first or second time in the history of the world a free vote was taken in which the people decided to form a nation. This is an extraordinary aspect of this country, which is not taught to children, it's not taught to new immigrants to Australia, and it should be. The consequences were remarkable. We remained a democracy all that time, and we became a democracy which made its mark on the world, losing, for example, in the First and Second World War, many more as a percentage of the casualties who were killed than the United States of America. A remarkable contribution to the history of the world. It was really something exceptional. We established a federal parliament with federation, a federal parliament with limited powers. limited powers set out in the Constitution. I'll come to what Leon was talking about in a moment. And that's very important. When we were looking at the 1999 referendum, I did a little bit of research and I found that there were 9 occasions on which the Australian people had been asked by referendum to give more powers to Canberra. 9 occasions on which they'd been asked more than once to give more powers to Canberra, and they'd refused on all occasions. But then when I was looking at it, I thought there wouldn't be a need for a referendum on any of these today, because the interpretation of the Constitution had changed. The Constitution had been interpreted by the judges with the collaboration of the politicians to give much more power to Canberra. A whole new approach to constitutional interpretation had gradually been adopted. This was something which came up in the last American election, which we've just seen the results of, with President Trump inaugurated this morning.
Yes.
And when President Trump gave his Gettysburg Address, where he set out his agenda, the first item on that agenda was that he would appoint judges who would interpret the Constitution as it originally was, not as they wanted it to be today. This became a big issue in the American election. It's not realised in Australia that it is an equally big issue in Australia, because we have a very sound constitution, and yet it has been changed without the people agreeing to it. And let me give you some examples. Take, for example, what Leon was referring to, the just terms provision. There's a provision in the Constitution, there's a list of powers in the Constitution. The idea being that this new Commonwealth of Australia would have limited powers, and the states would continue as sovereign states, and there would be the development of new states, for example, in North Queensland and in New South Wales. You see, one of our problems in Australia is too much influence is concentrated, particularly in Sydney, where I come from, Melbourne and Brisbane. They've become mega cities. They dominate their parliaments because they have all the seats based on their cities. And if this country is to develop, we really need more states. New South Wales could be at least 4, I think, 3 or 4. Queensland could be 2 or 3, and Victoria perhaps 2. There is a need for more states, and that was what was intended in the Constitution, but the politicians have managed to avoid that. And they've also, in relation to the specific powers given to Canberra, they've interpreted them in such a way as to give Canberra more powers. They're all set out, most of the powers, in section 51, which says that the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws for the peace, order and good government of Australia with respect to, and then they list these powers. And one of them is the power to acquire property on just terms. To acquire property on just terms. That's pretty clear. But the Howard government entered into an agreement with the states to enforce or to give effect to the Kyoto Protocol, as Leon explained. The Howard government said that the states under this big dispute in the United States, which is about the original intention of the Constitution, you have to ask yourself, well, what did marriage mean when the people approved the Constitution in the 19th century? Well, obviously they knew what marriage meant. They knew, for example, that polygamous marriage existed. They didn't want to give the Commonwealth power to legislate to create polygamous marriage. They certainly meant that marriage was marriage between a man and a woman for life to the exclusion of others, subject to divorce, because that existed at the time. That's what they meant. Now, if that is to be changed, it should be changed constitutionally. That is by a referendum, by the people, and the people deciding the referendum, yes, we want to change the definition of marriage. As you know, there's a debate about same-sex marriage. There's also the practice of the Commonwealth to expend taxpayers' money to support polygamous marriages. Why should the Commonwealth support polygamous marriages when it has no constitutional power to do that under the Constitution? So marriage should not be changed until the people agree to change it. And then, of course, there's a provision in the Constitution which I should mention in the presence of farmers. It's something that no politician talks about except Senator Hanson, and she's been talking about it for years. And this is Section 100. The judges, the politicians, and the academics play it down. They say it's a dead letter. Doesn't mean anything. In the Constitutional Conventions, an enormous amount was spent debating this and agreeing on the terms. And what it says is, the Commonwealth shall not, by any law or regulation, abridge the right of a state or the residents thereof to the reasonable use of the waters of rivers for conservation and irrigation. In other words, farmers have a constitutionally entrenched right, according to the Constitution, to the reasonable use of waters of rivers for conservation and irrigation. The section is very clear, but it's been played down. It's been played down by the courts and the academics saying, well, because the external affairs power has increased, that is, because treaties have been made, and if you make a treaty, the Commonwealth therefore gets the power to enforce that treaty. This has no meaning because all of those treaties about the environment override this. The section very clearly says that farmers or residents have a right to the reasonable use of the waters of rivers for conservation or irrigation. It's very important that we insist, as they have in the recent election of President Trump, that we insist on the Constitution in its terms, as agreed by the people, being enforced until it is changed. In this book that I referred to, Gives Back Our Country, we have a chapter, Why Do They Hate Our Farmers? And I cannot imagine how more clearly that has been demonstrated by the stories we've heard tonight. The way in which farmers are subject to punitive actions by governments, to surveillance, even, I believe, satellite surveillance, as if they are enemies of Australia. They are being treated as if they are criminals. Why indeed do they hate our farmers? And this is quite extraordinary. The problem in Australia, I believe, is that the standard of political representation has declined significantly from the time of federation. The political parties no longer choose candidates on the basis of merit. political parties now choose candidates on the basis of their allegiance to the power brokers who run the parties. They're not chosen according to national interest, they're chosen according to self-interest. What we're seeing now, instead of the broad number of broad types of Australians who went into the federal parliament, where you had, for example, a Prime Minister of Australia who'd been a train driver, Chifley, or journalist, Curtin, or a top QC, KC, before he went into parliament, Menzies, you're seeing very similar sorts of people coming into parliament. They are all being picked up from Liberal and Labour clubs in the universities. They all work as advisors, or most of them work as advisors in ministerial offices. When the Labour Party, they come in as trade union officials, but they don't rise in the trade union. If, for example, it's the plumbers union, they don't come up as a plumber. They're taken from the university and they're put in as a union official, and they're all there aiming for a safe seat in Parliament, and to get that safe seat, they have to promise allegiance to a power broker. And then at some stage, when they get tired of this, they haven't risen too high, or they don't become Prime Minister, at some stage, well before retirement, the retirement that you and I are accustomed to, they announce to the media, I want to spend more time with my family. Which is followed by the immediate grant of platinum. They enter into a platinum superannuation fund, if they're under the old scheme, or just the gold-plated superannuation fund, better than is available to anybody here. Then follows rivers of gold, which come from jobs for the boys, but also jobs, lobbying, directorships and consultancies negotiated while they were in office, which is forbidden in most countries because it is so obviously corrupting, because so obviously while you're in office you will make decisions in favour of the people you're aiming to get this lucrative position with. It is absolutely appalling. And what is absolutely appalling is all of this is demonstrated most by the recent upset, the recent scandal, the revived scandal over entitlements. And they're going to have they've got a report on this, and a big part of the report, as far as I can see, apart from spending a lot of money to police it, they're going to drop the word entitlement. What you have to have in this sort of situation, and the amount of money involved won't correct the deficit, but it is still significant. What you have to have is leadership from the top, which we had during the convict colony after 1788, because when the fleets didn't arrive with the food because of shipwrecks, when the harvests failed, Governor Arthur Phillip had to take the tough decision of reducing rations. And he reduced the male ration to 2/3. Brought it down, he already brought it down, he brought it down further to 2/3. It applied to convicts. It applied to soldiers. It applied to officers, and they didn't like it. But it also applied to the governor. In the same way that when they brought in rationing in London in the Second World War, rationing for everybody, it applied to Churchill and it applied to the King and the royal family. You've got to show leadership from the top, which is so absolutely deficient in this country, where we have a veritable aristocracy living another life, living off the fat of the land, and really disappointing the people. So what are the solutions? The politicians, when they're pressed, will come up with solutions. We're told, for example, there's the tired old saying, if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. and the argument is you must pay politicians a lot of money. We didn't pay politicians anything once. We still had some very good politicians. You get in very good people without paying them a lot of money. The argument is that everything should be centralised in Canberra. There's always an argument in this country. If there's a problem in this country, you make everything uniform and centralise power in Canberra and throw money at it, and that will be the solution. Or, for example, hand over more power to the United Nations. Introduce longer terms. We were told in my state, I'm sure in your state, that if politicians got an extra year, 4 years instead of 3 years, they'd have that time to improve governance. Certainly didn't happen in New South Wales. Introduce fixed terms so that we'd know when the dates of elections were. And there are other suggestions which are made. The solutions, I believe, are in our institutions. The solutions are in our hands and our insistence on those solutions. And I've summarised them, I would summarise them tonight as the 4 R's. You know, in education you have the 3 R's, I think we have the 4 R's. First, return to the Constitution. Go back to what the Constitution meant, what our forefathers said it meant. Let it be changed if the people want to change it, but until then, let the Constitution stand as it was intended. Secondly, reform the parties, and I'll come back to that. Third, introduce recall elections, and fourthly, introduce citizen initiative referendums. So going to those very briefly. Firstly, return to the Constitution. We have to return to the constitutional principles. And for an organisation such as this, Section 100, which gives constitutionally entrenched rights to the reasonable use of rivers, that rules out, doesn't it? That rules out the separation between the ownership of the water and the ownership of the land. That couldn't coexist with this, where you hand over, as Peter pointed out, the ownership of the water, which ends up in the hands of merchant bankers in New York at phenomenal prices. In fact, Peter told me on one occasion he spoke to a banker who was boasting to him about the fortune he was planning to make from cornering water rights that were made available under the Howard government. So we must return to the constitutional principles. And it will return a lot to us. If we return to being a true federation, according to a report given to the state governments in 2004 by 2 experts, Professor Anne Toomey, Professor of Law at Sydney University, and Professor Glenn Withers, Professor of Economics, they argued that if we return to being a true federation, as Switzerland is, as Germany is, the return would be about 10% of GDP, 10% annually of GDP. Now, I worked that out at about $150 billion a year in money saved by the reduction in waste, by the duplication of activities by Canberra with the states. $150 billion. That in a couple of years would soon fix up that deficit. The second thing we must do, and it can be done by legislation, and it will be done if there is enormous support for it, is to reform the political parties. The parties are in a mess. They are run by cabals of those of power brokers, and they have to be changed. They should be required, under pressure, they should be required, in return for the financial privileges they're getting. Remember, they get $2.60, more than $2.60 for each of your first preference votes. In return for that, in return for the exemptions from the Privacy Act and the exemptions from the Electoral Act, they should have to do something. In return for all of that, they should be required to be open, transparent and democratic, as so many parties are across the world. And the third matter, the third R, is to introduce recall elections. You should be able, by petition at any time, to recall a particular member of parliament, a particular senator, or even a government. They were promised in New South Wales before the Liberals were elected. It was soon abandoned after they took office. If you have a petition in many states of the United States gathering between 20% up to 40% of electors, a new election has to be held. And that would make the politicians truly accountable. The final matter is something which two parties, I know at least, have in their agenda. One is One Nation, the other is the Christian Democrats. That is to introduce citizen initiative referenda. The Swiss do this all the time. They have petitions. Every 3 months they produce a list of questions on which the people vote. Voting is voluntary, it's done by post, and the people decide what is to happen in the country. This has changed politicians in Switzerland compared with every other country in the world. Politicians are part-time, they're ordinary people, they're not surrounded by vast numbers of advisors. You have a petition, the petition is to put a question to the people. It's either to revoke some legislation or to introduce new legislation. The most controversial in Switzerland in recent years was that Swiss people were tired of seeing mosques with large minarets being built in little towns in the Swiss Alps, and they had a referendum on whether that should be allowed, and they decided not to. We should call for the election of a convention, and if Peter agrees, I'll draft a petition to go onto his site. A petition for a convention, an elected convention with unpaid delegates to decide on the reform of the constitutional system. This is how we federated. I won't be too long. This is how we federated. In 1893, federation was not getting anywhere. The convention would meet, they'd put together a constitution, and would go back to each of the now state parliaments, and they'd tear it apart, and they'd never agree. In 1893, Sir John Quick, whose name should be known by every school child in Australia, but isn't, Sir John Quick proposed, and it was adopted at Corowa, that in future, conventions should be directly elected. Once they agreed on a draft constitution, it should be sent to the state parliaments. They should be allowed to comment. Then the convention should decide on the final form and send it to the people in a referendum. That's what we need. We need a convention elected by the people of Australia, meeting cheaply, because today you can meet by Skype and committees can meet by telephone and email. Don't pay the delegates, because you'll only get people who want to make money out of it. Set up a convention and have the convention reform the constitutional system of Australia so that we could introduce citizen initiative referendums, recall elections, a recall on any decision of the High Court that we don't like, votes on international treaties. All these are available in Switzerland. We should increase the power of the Australian people. That is my suggested solution, and if you and Peter agree, we'll draft something and put it on Peter's site. So on that I will conclude. Thank you.